Andrew, thank you very much. Now I have two people to explore this story further. With me on set is Mohammed Al-Masri. He's the chair of the Journalism and Cultural Studies program at the Doha Institute. Welcome. And joining us from New York is Andreas Krieg, who's a professor at King's College London. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much for being on the NewsGrid. Mohammed, let me start with you. There's clearly censorship going on here, but who is censoring whom?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, you can easily make the argument that Snapchat is part and parcel to this censorship, and I think that cuts at the core of what's happening here. When a company, a media company, decides to, as they say, abide by government law, and in this case, an autocratic government's law, then it raises all kinds of interesting questions about global standards of freedom of expression and whether or not media companies should be forced to comply, or if they should be forced to comply with the global standard of freedom of expression.
Right, but suppose Snapchat had decided not to comply with the Saudi demand. The Saudis would have still found a way to block the company in Saudi Arabia, wouldn't they?
Right. Well, this isn't the first time that a company, a tech company or a media company has decided to comply with the laws to censor. Recently, both Apple and Amazon decided to comply with Chinese government law. That was just earlier in 2017. So this isn't the first case. What Snapchat fears is losing access to a giant market in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has the 8th largest.
Corporate interests are at play here.
Sure, this is a business decision, and they're afraid of losing the Saudi Arabian market, and also perhaps the other markets in the other blockading countries, especially Egypt, which has like 95 million people.
Right. Let me bring in Andreas Krieg in New York, Mohammed. Andreas, what we have here is a technology company clearly caught in the crossfires of geopolitics. What does this latest move by the Saudis say about the current GCC crisis and where we're headed? Are we entering a new area, a new era where we could see more companies forced, in a way, to choose sides?
I don't know if it's a new era, a new phase. I think the issue here is that we have departed from a conflict over interest and a conflict over issues and gone into a clash over narratives, which is a clash over narrative that's been fought in the public sphere. It's about, freedom of expression on one side and on Qatar's side, and on the other side it's about the monopoly over controlling information, controlling the news. That's, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular. They have clamped down over the recent years anyway on many of the social media outlets, because the social media are generally very difficult to control. And Snapchat is just, it's an app that is being used extensively for news as well. And I mean, having Al Jazeera implanted in the app, means that, Al Jazeera can circumvent the general blockade of Al Jazeera in these countries and get information and news to people that might not be necessarily what the government wants to see. So in this kind of clash of narratives, I think it's quite clear that the Saudi government, and particularly Qahtani, who's running the government communications office, is very nervous about news that he doesn't approve being disseminated within a group of more than 8 million people in Saudi Arabia. That is something that could potentially spread dissidence and destabilize the country. So they're very fearful of that.
Sure. Mohammed, Andreas says this is about stifling, of course, free speech and so on. What does the move by Saudi Arabia say, in fact, about the power of social media in the Arab world today? And if other countries follow suit, like the UAE, what impact would that have on the Arab media landscape?
Well, Arab governments are increasingly having to grapple with the power of social media. You have tens of millions of Arabs online using things like Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram. There's a lot of evidence that these social media sites can help dictate the public agenda, and in some cases even the traditional media agenda. So I think that in some ways, you can understand why Saudi Arabia would want to censor this. Al Jazeera, Snapchat is quite popular in their country. On the other hand, from the standpoint of freedom of expression and basic principles of sort of democratic freedom, this is certainly a move that should be criticized.
But people can still get around this, right?
It's not always easy to get around it. Right. I mean, you have to sort of be tech savvy in order to get around these sorts of things. So I think the immediate impact on the ground is that millions of people in Saudi Arabia are not going to have access to Al Jazeera, Snapchat. And in some ways, that's tragic, because this Gulf crisis is proceeding via the mass media. It's largely a media war.
Indeed. Let's give the last word to Andreas in New York. Andreas, Snapchat, coming back to it, is a publicly traded American company. What responsibility does it have to uphold freedom of expression and Western values in these countries?
Well, they clearly took, business before values here. I mean, that's quite clear. And unlike Twitter or Facebook, which are well-established companies who have, really taken, for the most part, have tried to cherish freedom of speech and champion freedom of speech, Snapchat is more of a lifestyle product. And as a lifestyle product, I don't think they have such high values when it comes to the freedom of expression. And for them, as was rightly said before, it's a business decision. It's about making sure that, A, you don't push investors too far, and many investors could potentially be in Saudi Arabia, and then you don't want to lose these very lucrative markets, because in the GCC or in the Gulf and also in Egypt, in the Middle East, Snapchat has been a way to circumvent some of the social norms as well. I mean, that's where people go dating, that's where people communicate off the grid, so to speak, of government control. And in that way, it's a very much containing, and Snapchat was part of this liberalization technology, as I call it, and Twitter, Facebook being also part of this. Right. But Snapchat is a small company. They have a lot of problems financially, and they need to think about business first.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Andreas Krieg in New York. Mohammed Al-Masri here in Doha with me. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. Thank you.